Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Okay, so we're diving deep into détente, and well, it's complicated, right? It's this weird mix of agreements that were supposed to prevent nuclear war, but also kind of solidified the whole Iron Curtain thing.
Yeah, it's like Détente forces us to rethink what stability really means.
Yeah.
It wasn't about erasing the differences between East and West, no, but more about managing those differences, even like almost fostering them in a way, but in a way that made sure MID, mutually assured destruction didn't happen.
Right. It's a lot to wrap your head around, like walking a tightrope between working together and, still being rivals.
Exactly.
So let's start with SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation talks. Basically, the US and the USSR, at the peak of this nuclear standoff, decided to limit their arsenals. Like, what led to that?
Well, Saltabai with the ABM Treaty and the interim agreement both signed in '72, it was all about managing the unthinkable.
Yeah.
Like take the ABM Treaty, for example. It limited each superpower to just 2 ABM sites.
So wait, instead of building up these massive missile defense shields, they decided to leave themselves vulnerable. Why would they do that?
Because of mad mutually assured destruction. It's grim, but the logic goes. If one side felt too safe, they might be tempted to strike first, thinking they were untouchable.
Oh, I see.
So this balance of terror, as messed up as it sounds, was actually the foundation of stability during the Cold War.
Yeah, grim reality, but I get it. Makes sense that if both sides knew any attack meant total annihilation, they'd be less likely to even try it.
Exactly.
But SALT did more than prevent the worst-case scenario, right? It also put limits on the arms race itself.
Yeah, the interim agreement basically froze the number of ICBMs and SLBMs for 5 years.
Yeah.
It's like a timeout.
Which they desperately needed.
Yeah, a much-needed breather in a time of crazy escalation.
So SALT, I didn't end the Cold War, but it was a start. Did it at least lay the groundwork for future arms control talks?
Oh, absolutely. It proved that these two rivals could actually sit down, negotiate, and make agreements about things that could literally end the world, even if those talks, didn't always go smoothly.
Which leads us to SALT. Exactly, SALT II. Signed in '79, it tried to go even further, right? Didn't it try to not just limit the number of nukes, but also how powerful they were?
That's right. SALT II was all about limiting the actual missiles and bombers and restricting the development of new, even more powerful weapons. One of the big things was trying to put limits on MRVs.
MIRVs? Man, that's scary. Just the tech involved, trying to defend against a whole swarm of warheads instead of just one. It's no wonder SALT II had trouble containing that.
Yeah, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in '79 really threw a wrench in the works.
Right.
SALT II, even though it was signed, never actually got ratified by the U.S. Senate, became a casualty of those reignited Cold War tensions.
Such a delicate balance. So even though SALT II failed in the end, did it still have an impact? Just the fact that both sides at least tried and followed it for a while?
I think so. It shows how powerful diplomacy is, even when it's messy. Even without being legally binding, the agreements made during Détente had a real effect on how the superpowers acted, at least for a time.
Makes you realize how precarious this détente thing was, walking that tightrope between working together and competing. But before we get too deep into the nuclear side, let's switch gears to a different arena where détente played a big role, a divided city that symbolized the whole Iron Curtain.
You're talking about Berlin?
Yeah, Berlin, a city split in two, but also a testament to détente's ability to build bridges, both literally and figuratively. It's hard to imagine that a city divided by a wall could become a symbol of stability, even cooperation. Where do we even start with this part of détente?
Well, it all started with Willy Brandt, the West German chancellor. He had this really audacious policy called Ostpolitik. Basically, he pushed for closer ties with East Germany, which eventually led to the 1970 Moscow Treaty.
Okay, so on the surface, formally recognizing East Germany, including that heavily guarded border with Poland, the Oder-Neisse line, it sounds like a win for the Soviets. What did the West gain from that?
Well, it did give the Soviet Union some international legitimacy, formally acknowledging those post-World War II boundaries.
Yeah.
But the treaty, it went beyond just maps and lines. Both West Germany and the Soviets promised to renounce the use of force against each other.
So a commitment to diplomacy over war. How did that shape what came after?
It became like the foundation for cooperation. Eventually, it even led to the reunification of Germany. It's a really powerful example of how détente, instead of ignoring the existing reality, used it as a starting point for future possibilities.
Wow, that's incredible considering how divided things were back then. But this wasn't just a two-player game, right? Especially when it came to Berlin, there were other key players at the table.
Absolutely. The final Quadripartite Agreement, signed in 71 by the US, USSR, Britain, and France, is a perfect example of that. This
Right.
agreement was all about stabilizing Berlin.
Which, considering Berlin's history as like a Cold War flashpoint, was no easy task. How'd they manage to keep the city from boiling over?
Okay, so imagine this. You've got four world powers, each with their own agenda, right? And they all agree to respect each other's rights in Berlin, even though it's still divided. They guaranteed access routes to West Berlin recognized its unique status. It was all about making sure that the city's tensions didn't spark a bigger conflict.
So they basically agreed to disagree. And that actually helped de-escalate things. Did this set a precedent for other aspects of Détente?
It really highlights how détente wasn't about erasing their differences, but finding a way to manage them.
Right.
It was about coexisting, not necessarily agreeing. And this approach, it even extended to the relationship between East and West Germany themselves. They signed the Basic Treaty in 72.
1972. It's wild to think it took until then for East and West Germany to formally recognize each other, like siblings finally ending a long feud just by acknowledging the other exists. What impact did that have?
It was a huge symbolic step, but it also had very real consequences. They agreed to establish permanent missions in each other's capitals, and that paved the way for both Germanys to join the UN in 73.
Wow, giving them a legitimate place on the world stage. It's incredible how Détente, even with all its limitations, it still opened up these possibilities that seemed impossible just a few years earlier.
It really shows the power of dialogue and diplomacy. Even at the peak of the Cold War, with this huge ideological divide between East and West Germany, they were able to find common ground.
And speaking of finding common ground in the middle of these ideological divides, let's talk about one of Détente's most ambitious achievements, the Helsinki Accords. This agreement was huge. 35 nations, including the USSR, and most of Europe came together in 1975.
It was remarkable. The Helsinki Accords aimed to create a framework for cooperation across the Iron Curtain. And it wasn't just about security and economics either. It surprisingly also addressed human rights.
That's pretty surprising considering the Soviet Union's stance on human rights. Was that a point of contention during the negotiations?
That's what makes the Helsinki Accords so interesting. They weren't just about keeping things in Europe the same. They had these provisions that, looking back, actually ended up weakening the Soviet system from within.
So it was a calculated risk for both sides. The West acknowledges the Soviet Union's control, and in exchange, the Soviets potentially give a voice to internal dissent.
Exactly. It's that tension, that uncertainty, where the real story of détente plays out. It wasn't about creating world peace. It was about navigating a bunch of calculated risks and often contradictory impulses.
Fascinating. So how did this play out practically, especially Basket 3, which focused on human rights?
For dissidents in the Eastern Bloc, the Helsinki Accords were revolutionary. It gave them a framework, an internationally recognized document, to challenge their own governments on things like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion.
These are freedoms that we often take for granted, but were constantly under threat in those Soviet-controlled nations. Did this embolden dissent?
Without a doubt, groups like Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia and the Workers' Defense Committee in Poland, they used the Helsinki Accords to demand more freedoms. They held their governments accountable to the promises, even if those promises were just words on paper.
That must have taken incredible courage to defy those regimes with such potentially huge consequences. How did the Soviet Union respond to this wave of dissent?
It was a mix of repression and reluctantly giving in a little.
Right.
On the one hand, they couldn't just ignore an agreement they signed in front of the whole world.
Right.
But on the other hand, they weren't going to give up their control over Eastern Europe without a fight.
A real balancing act for sure. Did this dynamic differ between the various Soviet satellite states?
Oh, absolutely. It was really complex, played out differently in every nation.
Yeah.
But one thing's for sure, the Helsinki Accords had this ripple effect that the Soviets totally didn't see coming.
And as this wave of dissent was growing, a new figure came onto the world stage, someone who would become synonymous with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union.
Mikhail Gorbachev.
Gorbachev.
He inherited a Soviet Union that was dealing with a ton of pressure, both internally and externally. And he saw détente not as a weakness, but as a strategic opportunity.
Interesting. Most leaders would have taken a hardline approach in that situation. What was Gorbachev's strategy?
Gorbachev knew things had to change if the Soviet Union was going to survive. He believed that dialogue and cooperation with the West, not confrontation, was the best way forward. This led to his reforms, perestroika and glasnost, restructuring the economy, and loosening restrictions on free speech.
perestroika and glasnost revolutionary concepts for the Soviet Union, were they a direct result of détente, or was Gorbachev just responding to a changing world?
It's complicated. While not a direct result, détente definitely changed the game. Gorbachev's reforms, those pillars of openness and restructuring, they probably wouldn't have happened without détente laying the groundwork. It's like détente opened a window and Gorbachev saw the opportunity and decided to just throw the whole thing wide open.
Fascinating dynamic, but I'm guessing not everyone in the Soviet leadership was happy about this new approach, right?
You're right. The hardliners in the Soviet system, they saw détente as giving in to the West, a dangerous compromise of their ideology and power.
So did Gorbachev's embrace of détente accidentally contribute to the very forces that would bring down the Soviet Union?
That's the question historians are still debating. Did those seeds of dissent sown by détente and nurtured by the human rights provisions of Helsinki eventually grow into a force that even the mighty Soviet Union couldn't control?
It's like a historical feedback loop. The West pushes for human rights, the Soviets reluctantly agree, and those ideas take root and end up contributing to the downfall of the very system that tried to suppress them.
History is rarely straightforward. Détente is a perfect example of how seemingly small actions can have these huge, long-lasting consequences. But while we've been focusing on Europe, let's not forget that the Cold War was a global conflict.
That's right. While Europe was a central stage, the US and the Soviet Union were playing this global chess match, fighting for influence on every continent. Did détente manage to keep things balanced on this larger, more complex board?
That's where things get even more complicated.
Yeah.
The Middle East, for example, became this testing ground where the limits of détente became really clear.
Okay, so the Middle East, even without the Cold War, is already a very complex region. How did the US and Soviet Union handle this already volatile situation?
Imagine a region that's super important strategically. Oil reserves religious and cultural significance and a long history of competing nationalisms, ideologies, and grievances.
A recipe for instability, to say the least.
Exactly. And into this already tense situation, you add the two Cold War superpowers, each one competing for influence, supporting different sides, often working against each other. It wasn't exactly a recipe for détente.
So while there were these efforts towards a broader détente on the ground in the Middle East, things were very different.
Exactly. Take the Arab-Israeli conflict, for example. It became a major flashpoint.
Yeah.
Both superpowers tried to position themselves as mediators, even peacemakers, while at the same time they were supplying their allies with weapons.
Which, as we've seen so many times in history, often means you're just adding fuel to the fire you're claiming to want to put out.
It's the classic case of realpolitik winning out over idealism. The U.S. was mainly backing Israel, and the Soviets were aligned with Arab states like Egypt and Syria. And this wasn't just talk. It meant huge arms deals, military advisors, and diplomatic cover at the UN.
So they were trying to keep up this appearance of global détente, but in reality, especially in the Middle East, things were much different. What impact did this have on the region and on détente as a whole?
So we've been talking about détente from the nuclear balance of terror to the complexities of the Middle East. But in the middle of all these high-stakes negotiations and geopolitical moves, it's easy to forget about the human side of things.
That's really important. Détente wasn't just about treaties and summits. It had this huge cultural and societal impact that often gets overlooked.
Exactly. Beyond the politics and the negotiating tables, there were real people living through this thaw in the Cold War. So did détente, with this easing of tensions, actually lead to cultural exchange? Absolutely. For the first time in decades, people from the East and West could actually interact more freely. Athletes competed, musicians toured across the Iron Curtain. Scientists worked together on research projects.
So even though the world was divided ideologically, people were reconnecting through shared experiences. It sounds like there was this human desire to bridge that gap.
Exactly. This exchange wasn't without its critics, though. Some people saw it as just propaganda. Others worried about losing their cultural identity.
Yeah, I get that. Such a big change would definitely raise some eyebrows. Did these cultural exchanges ultimately help or hurt the goals of détente?
I'd say they were a good thing. Think about it for decades. Fear and distrust had defined the Cold War. These exchanges, even with all their complications, helped to humanize the other side. It reminded people on both sides that they had more in common than their governments wanted them to believe.
It really shows you how powerful human connection can be, even when there are political divides. But as we know, détente didn't last. What caused it to unravel?
That's a question historians are still trying to figure out. There wasn't one single thing that killed it. More like a gradual breakdown of trust. The ongoing tensions in the Middle East, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in '79, the rise of a more aggressive U.S. foreign policy under Reagan, all these things played a part.
So basically a perfect storm of events, both internal and international, that eventually destroyed the foundation of détente. It's interesting, though, that even as détente fell apart, agreements like SALT-DRO and the Helsinki Accords mostly stayed in place.
That's a really important point. It tells us that even as the overall spirit of cooperation faded, both sides still saw the value in those frameworks that were established during détente.
So it wasn't a complete do-over. What does that tell us about how we should view détente's legacy?
It's not a simple success or failure. It's more like a relationship that ends, but you still learn things from it, even if you don't always use those lessons perfectly.
So what are those lasting lessons? What can we learn from both the successes and failures of détente?
One really important lesson is that dialogue is crucial, even with your enemies. Refusing to talk only leads to more suspicion and misunderstanding. And that's true whether we're talking about arms control, regional conflicts, or even global issues like climate change that need cooperation.
So communication is key, even if that first conversation is really difficult. What else can we take away from this?
Détente shows us that even when the world seems totally divided by ideology or geopolitics, there's still common ground if we're willing to look for it. We're all connected, sharing this planet, facing the same threats, whether we admit it or not.
Looking for what we share rather than what divides us, even when those divisions seem impossible to overcome. It's a message that's maybe even more important now in our modern world, where things often feel as uncertain and divided as they did during the Cold War.
Détente, even with all its complications and shortcomings, offers a little bit of hope. It proves that even when faced with challenges that seem impossible to solve, diplomacy, dialogue, and a commitment to finding common ground can actually make a difference.
What a powerful note to end on. You've given us a lot to think about, from the delicate balance of nuclear deterrence to the surprising connections built through cultural exchange. It's clear that détente, even though it didn't last, was a crucial moment in history with important lessons we can still learn from today. So that's our deep dive on détente. Hopefully you're leaving this feeling informed, intrigued, and maybe even inspired to look for those glimmers of hope, those chances for cooperation in our own time. Until next time, keep asking those big questions.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.